Okay, so thank you very much for coming for this session on AI-generated intimate images and the challenges that they represent. So I will hand it over to David Hunter from Resolver, who will be both moderating and be a speaker. So already we'll have only one microphone, but two roles. So David, I will let you introduce yourself, your panelists, and then wishing you a successful discussion. Thank you.
So thanks, folks. Apologies for the delay. We are without a moderator, so I will ask the questions and answer the questions, which might look weird. We'll see how it goes. I am VP of Trust and Safety at Resolver. We were formerly a company you may know called Crisp. We've been around since 2005, recently rebranded and merged and combined forces with one of our sister companies, Resolver, based in the UK, looking at online harms and trust and safety solutions for many, many years. So we can talk more about that if you find me through the day or tomorrow. I'll talk a bit about what the work we do in relation to generative AI and kind of online technologies in a moment, but if you want to introduce yourselves and yeah, we'll jump in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelly Hingorani. I head up policy advocacy and research for We Protect Global Alliance. For those of you who are not familiar with the Alliance, we were founded on the simple premise that no single stakeholder can comprehensively respond to technology-facilitated child sexual abuse and exploitation online by themselves. So we're an alliance of over 250 members, including 109 governments, about 70 technology companies, and many civil society organizations. Looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Fitter. I'm a director at Public. If you haven't come across Public, we are a digital transformation partner focused on the public sector, and we work closely with government regulators and regulated services, particularly in the online safety and national security space. I look after our strategy and transformation work. Yeah, I've just been delighted to sort of work on a range of 25, 30 online safety projects, from sort of technology mitigations and innovation in the safety tech sector through to safety by design projects and sort of everything in between. So looking forward to the discussion.
So when we think about generative AI specifically, where is your organization and your work taking you in terms of looking at, thinking about, worrying about generative AI, and what is it you've been concentrating on as a space? Probably if you carry on, Dan.
Yeah, so this is actually a really good time for this conversation. Obviously, this space has been moving incredibly quickly over the last 18 months. We've recently finished some research that's been looking at the sort of system-level risks from generative AI. So AI-generated and AI-enabled content, but harm more broadly. So harmful content, conduct, and commerce. And particularly looked at CSAM in that context and the kind of existing areas of mitigation that are underway, both by foundation models, but also sort of downstream by sort of the safety tech sector, and in the app, like the Gen AI app community, and a number of findings from that space. Alongside that, we've recently finished a piece of work sort of mapping end-to-end how automated content moderation best practices are playing out across different parts of the trust and safety and platform community. And I think one of the kind of key things there is sort of deepfake detection isn't one single classifier, it's not one single solution, but actually sort of it's layers, it's suites of technology that sort of really, it's really in its infancy at the moment. So looking forward to jumping into that.
Yeah, just to sort of chime in, so the overall approach that we take to technology-facilitated child sexual abuse and exploitation is that we're interested in better understanding existing harms, right? These are harms that we already have a lot of knowledge about. So for instance, financial sexual extortion. And we're also interested in understanding emerging harms or emerging risks, right? They tend to be tied to one another. So when I talk about emerging harms, I'm specifically thinking thinking about AI-generated CSAM, right, and the link that emerging harm has to AI. We're concerned as an alliance that although we've had several safety by design conversations around AI. These conversations tend to take place after AI models have already been released, after they have already been used to perpetrate abuse against children, right? While this is an excellent sort of forum and gathering to have this conversation, but I would humbly make the point that we should have had this conversation many years ago, right? AI has been on the horizon for a long time. If you're serious about child protection, if you're serious about safety by design, we need to start having these conversations much earlier in the product cycle so that we can embed safety by design features into new technologies before they are misused.
So thinking about the work we do at Resolver, so our main job is to work for online platforms and help them understand the risk that their platforms are under, whether it's something that they have built themselves that's putting them at risk, or whether it's users looking to exploit their systems that are putting them at risk. We do this through monitoring the kind of communities that are talking about these types of technologies, how they're using them, how they're sharing tips on the best way to use a model or the best prompts to use that may come together. Interesting to think about, and you kind of touched on it in terms of, we're talking about this being a new challenge, but actually, is generative AI providing new risks and new harms, or is it just making the existing kind of problem space more complex? Either of you want to jump in?
I think that's a really important question. I'm currently involved in a project that's revising the Luxembourg guidelines that were issued in 2016. These are guidelines for the child protection sort of community on the appropriate sort of terms to use to refer to different types of abuse. And one discussion that we've sort of been having in our interagency working group is the fact that is it appropriate for us to refer to AI-generated CSAM as AI-generated CSAM, or does that sort of take attention away from the fact that at the end of the day, it's CSAM, right? You would have also witnessed several conversations about CSAM on the dark web, right? Is it relevant for us to keep attaching either as prerequisites or in sort of after the abuse term, the location of where the abuse is taking place, right? The environment in which the abuse is taking place. Is that relevant? What is it telling us, right? If you were to take a child-centered sort of approach to the problem, you would focus on the fact that children are being harmed, that children are being victimized. Yes, the environment is important to comment on, because then we can start having a discussion about whether or not certain regulations apply. But more broadly speaking, I think we need to move away from thinking about sort of risks associated with particular technologies. Yes, that's an important conversation, but start thinking more broadly in terms of how technologies are facilitating already existing abuse types, right? And how, when children sort of, this sort of comes up frequently in conversations with children, when they think about the digital world or the physical world, they're not thinking about them as dichotomous worlds, right? That's not how they approach these worlds. They approach them as if they were part of the same continuum, right? So yes, emphasize the fact that certain types of child sexual abuse are being facilitated by technology, but let's remember that the distinction between the digital and physical worlds is not a pertinent distinction for most children.
I think Accenture, which was my old world, used to talk about digital physical blur. And I think there's sort of something to that, whether it's sort of from a customer perspective or actually from a harm perspective. Just to answer your question, David, I think there's something there. Firstly, I think it's both and. Generative AI is accelerating and changing dynamics of traditional harms that we've seen in sort of traditional platforms and in existing sort of content. But it's also, I think, creating new areas and novel harms, particularly by application. And I think sort of from our research, we found 5 key characteristics of generative AI and its impact on sort of online harm. Firstly, the element of speed, so enabling production of content contact and conduct sort of at machine speed, the scale, so ability to, with relatively low technical barriers to produce large volumes of content. The realism element, obviously anyone that's seen the kind of Sora release earlier this year from OpenAI, the kind of video generated content, the level of authenticity and reality, it's really difficult to distinguish between sort of human and Gen AI generated contact. Normalization, and I think this is really interesting from a CSAM perspective, increasing sort of normalization of harm in online environments. And then the fine-tuning element, which we might get into. But obviously for open source models, the ability for app ecosystems to develop around it, both sort of producing incredible sort of experiences and applications, but also bad actor communities on the dark web using open source models to create intimate image abuse and CSAM.
Yeah, I think that ease of technology is pretty key in terms of, this technology is enabling people who previously, didn't have the capability or the understanding to be able to do some of the things they're doing. We were talking earlier about the use of this technology by kind of, we would call them bad actors in one sense if they're creating intimate imagery, but actually they're not our typical bad actor persona. And we're looking at kind of younger users who are creating what is intimate imagery. We've seen reports from NCMEC in the US where they're seeing nearly 5,000 reports of CSAM that is actually AI-generated CSAM. But there is absolutely a growth in the use of this technology by younger users who actually may be doing it for what seems to be a humorous purpose, or they're doing it to their friends because they think it's funny to do in schools. But actually, as you say, this technology has become easy to use and available to people that previously wouldn't have had this before. That is a concern we have and something we're looking into a lot. Similarly, we're seeing commercial enterprises get created around this type of technology where apps or nudification apps or apps that you can put images in and they'll change them to basically realistic nude images. We're seeing these be commercialized. So we're seeing these being advertised on mainstream platforms. We're seeing them take payment for credits and tokens for use in their apps. And ultimately, these apps are being used to create CSAM. Even their advertisement and the promotion of these apps is to generate relatively young imagery or young models in their content. This isn't something we've seen previously. We haven't seen a mass advertisement of things to produce CSAM. And actually, it's in some countries there's no law in this being produced. So actually, there's a whole bunch of technology that's coming along way faster than laws and legislation are coming in. That is opening this up to an audience that wouldn't have had access to this before.
And just to bring that to life, in November last year, there was a high school in the US student who basically went around taking photos of female classmates and ended up basically using a Gen AI model to socialize nude AI-generated photos of his classmates. And I think that is just sort of, we've obviously seen the Taylor Swift intimate images earlier this year, and I think this is just sort of the start of a worrying trend. And exactly to your point, Shaylee, the conversation around prevention is only just beginning, and obviously with the rise of AI regulation in the EU with the AI Act, the UK taking more of a pro-innovation regulation approach, making sure that sort of online harm, in particular sort of like CSAM generation, is sort of very much at the heart of that conversation.
Yeah, if I can just come in, thinking about this conversation from a youth perspective, right? What really strikes me is the fact that we need to make a distinction between intimate images that are being generated in the context of a consensual romantic or sexual relationship versus imagery that is being generated in a non-consensual framework, right? So when we say intimate images, we know, and there's plenty of sort of research on evolving adolescent developmental norms that a lot of young adults and children are exchanging intimate images. But if that's happening in the context of a romantic or a sexual relationship, if there's consent involved, then that's a separate conversation than, the conversation that we want to have about non-consensual intimate imagery and the ways in which AI is being used to generate that. That's sort of my first point. The second point is I talked earlier about existing forms of harms and new emerging types of harms. Something that we're seeing in our research is how Gen AI models are being used for grooming, for instance. There are conversational AI models available, right, that are able to generate at speed and at a large scale highly personalized grooming scripts for predators, right? And these can be tailored to individual children, right? And if you were to think about, well, how is that really happening? There is a certain level of metadata that's available just on the basis of children's profiles on a lot of social media platforms, right? Perpetrators, offenders are often able to use this metadata, right, to then tailor their grooming conversation with children. So I think it's something to keep in mind, that it's not just about imagery, but it's also about how other types of AI models are being used to groom children into producing what we refer to in quotes as self-generated child sexual abuse material, right? So the children may think that they are consenting to the production of this imagery, but that may not be the case. The third point I want to quickly make is thinking about the integration of AI with other emerging technologies, right? So thinking about how AI is getting integrated with the metaverse or with extended reality and the repercussions that's going to have, because what we're moving towards is an integrated world where it's going to be difficult to separate out, that these are AI-related risks and these are extended reality-related risks, because those technologies are going to become so intermeshed that we'll start seeing what I think is a new era in terms of highly personalized grooming and abusive sort of situations being produced rapidly and at scale.
Now, just thinking about, the subject here, we're talking about generative AI and new technologies. Now, I've been in this space for nearly a decade, and thinking about there's always something new that comes along that captures the attention. I mean, we're talking about this here because it's a new problem, it's a hot problem. One of the things that I always think about is, well, there's so many things that also haven't been solved, and now we're thinking about generative AI. Have you got any thoughts on the risk that actually a lot of attention now goes to solve the problems that relate to generative AI, and actually the problems that relate to CSAM hosting, to grooming, to the things that are already happening anyway? It's the age-old trust and safety problem, where we've now just got a new problem. We haven't just got, we haven't got a bunch of solutions in there. Any thoughts on, is this going to pose a risk that actually this takes attention away from the 55 other things that should have also been solved?
Sure. So we do, as an alliance, a lot of work on regulation and legislation. And one concern that we have is that if we keep chasing after sort of new technologies without thinking fundamentally about the kind of regulation and legislation we need in place and whether or not that is future-proof, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we'll be expecting national governments to keep going back to their parliaments to make amendments to existing sort of legislation and regulations, right? So any conversation that we have on child sexual abuse needs to be technology neutral, right? And that's the point that I think my fellow panelists have also previously made in their remarks. And it needs to be future-proof so that we're not having to constantly reinvent content moderation policies, so that we're not having to constantly reinvent legislations and regulations, because new technologies are going to emerge. Bad actors are going to use these technologies to abuse children, right? So the best response that we can put in place, that we can institutionalize, is the conversation that we were having earlier about prevention, right? That's where the focus needs to be, not so much on what the latest technological fad is.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I would add sort of firstly, I think there is huge merit and great urgency in going after sort of AI safety. Hopefully we can sort of all largely agree on that this isn't just a problem of non-consensual intimate image generation or CSAM generation, but actually I think some of the upstream and system level areas for innovation and intervention and safety, whether that is sort of around sort of training data, whitelisting, and better sort of interrogation, better use of pushing search services that are largely sort of indexing different parts of the web to be very cautious about sort of what is potentially getting bad actors through to CSAM, whether it's AI or non-AI generated. But obviously sort of mis and disinformation, fraud, suicide and self-harm content, a lot of the kind of other illegal or sort of legal but harmful issues that I think arise from actually fixing some of those upstream issues. I think on red teaming, which is sort of obviously a conversation that we were having earlier in the other room, red teaming from a CSAM perspective on foundation models is a really difficult legal challenge at this point because of the liability around sort of being able to have access to illegal child sexual abuse material. And so I think there is something there around that. But I think fundamentally, this is a question of tools, techniques, and procedures of particularly sort of threat actors. So there's a piece there around sort of like tackling behaviors and understanding behaviors, which don't change really whether this is sort of AI generated or more traditional. But then I think there's something around also sort of downstream media literacy interventions. So helping children that maybe sort of don't recognize that they're moving into an illegal space and are just doing something for a laugh, to be honest, to understand sort of their risks with those kind of behaviors.
Yeah, I think something you touched on as well in terms of red teaming. What we're seeing is, the old world of the internet was a very, there was an issue on a particular platform. So if we were dealing with detection of grooming, we were talking about a relationship that potentially started and ended within a single environment. We've now seen that moves from users moving from one space to another, to an encrypted messenger environment, and so on. We've kind of got the same problem with some of this generative AI technology, where the intimate imagery or the CSAM that may be being produced actually may not be being produced in a single technology either. The guardrails are often in place in a lot of tools where you can't simply ask for either intimate imagery or content to be created, but actually by chaining apps together where images are almost, if you think about, from a tadpole to a frog, things are moving through that kind of space, which then becomes the wider problem, where we need a slightly more overarching view of how this technology generally is being used, whereas actually it may be 5 or 6 tools that are being used. And we've observed this. We've seen guides in predator communities where they're sharing information about this step through tools together will get users content. We've seen kind of worrying discussions around how to take absolutely innocent, non-intimate imagery that maybe have been uploaded by parents, maybe has been curated by predators who have a particular interest in a particular child or group of children, or even kind of more so, known victims that have been, had their content uploaded on the internet potentially over many years, where they're looking to then use technology to re-victimize, immortalize these users for their own interest and their purpose. So yeah, a bunch of stuff being paired together. Thinking about kind of mitigations and we're talking about safety by design, which is an overarching term. But what are you seeing other than red team? What are you seeing people do to make sure they are building tools that are safe? I don't think we believe most people are trying to build tools that are being used for harm, and hopefully there is a reduction in value if their tools are deemed to be harmful. But what are you seeing? What are people coming and asking you for in terms of making sure that their tools or their products are safe?
So as part of the research we recently completed for UK government, we were looking at sort of upstream through downstream sort of interventions and existing mitigations. And I think some of the things that we're seeing that a lot of the leading foundation model companies are doing around prompt controls, so sort of design into the system, detection, flagging or redaction of user inputs that are likely to evoke harmful outputs. There's a piece around output controls in a similar way to sort of folk that maybe are in the mis and disinformation community, where you have sort of a nudge message when a piece of misinformation has landed in your WhatsApp, and you're thinking about sort of forwarding it on to your entire contact list. There are sort of nudge design in some platforms that allow you to sort of think twice. And I think we're seeing some of those designs beginning to be considered or implemented by major foundation models, again, to detect or flag or redact harmful outputs. Because ultimately, the generation of a harmful image itself is only as really as risky as its reach and amplification. And so I think there's some really interesting innovation to be done around kind of that piece of safety by design. Obviously, once we're getting to content detection, the battle is almost being lost, given its machine speed and scale. But I think there is a huge amount of, I should say, the safety tech sector is beginning to pivot towards deepfake detection from having sort of focus on more classic content moderation and other techniques. Hash matching. One thing that we're seeing from our research is that some hash matching providers are increasing their thresholds or changing how they think about measurement of similarity in order to, and as obviously AI-generated images are becoming more realistic, and that is leading to sort of better capture of AI-generated images. So that's maybe a positive story, and I think we'll see more of that. I think hopefully we'll see more of AI-generated image databases, hash databases from NECMEC and IWF. So we'd love to continue that conversation offline. But there is room for hope, and I think there's a huge amount of room for innovation. So the UK, coming from London, the UK is taking more of a pro-innovation approach to regulating AI safety. But I think with that comes a real emphasis on making sure there is also innovation from a regtech perspective and from a mitigation perspective, as well as just allowing the kind of guardrails to go off and everything and anything to be built.
Yeah, just building on that, I think it's important to remember that we need mitigations at every stage of the product development cycle. So we need it at development, we need it when a product is deployed, we need it when products are being managed. And there are different sort of mitigation strategies that we need to adopt depending on the position in the cycle that we're at, right? So thinking about training data sets, for instance, right? I think it's important for developers to consider whether or not their training data sets have a combination of adult sort of pornography as well as children's images. So they may not be training their models on child sexual abuse material, but if they're training it on children's images and there's adult pornography in the mix, that is going to have consequences for the kind of images that the AI model will produce, right? But in terms of, strategies that we're seeing, something that has caught our eye is the expectation that AI models, when they generate an image and now video, will watermark these images, will watermark their videos, right? I'm not a technical person. I don't exactly understand how technically this is going to be feasible, but it's important to sort of capture whether something is artificially sort of generated, is synthetic or not. Because one of the challenges that we're facing with the rise in AI-generated CSAM is that it is complicating the law enforcement response, right? A lot of time is being spent on trying to sort of distinguish between what is quote-unquote real child sexual abuse material and what is artificially generated, but doesn't profile a child in the way of active harm, right? So I do think that watermarking images and videos is going to be useful. We're also seeing, and to your point about different sort of technology platforms and technologies being used, we see that perpetrators and offenders are generating synthetic sort of material using AI, but then they're posting it on social media platforms, right? They're advertising their services as somebody who can use AI models to generate even more child sexual abuse sort of material. And so it's really important for technology platforms then to have specific content moderation policies that very clearly ban AI-generated sort of CSAM. And we've already seen some social media platforms update their policies to say that photorealistic CSAM, as an example, is banned, right? Runs counter to their content moderation policies. We're also seeing governments sort of clarify that their existing laws on child sexual abuse material covers AI-generated CSAM, which I think is a really important clarification because, you know, these laws may not have been framed at a time when we were grappling with AI-generated CSAM. So it may feel retrospective, but I think it's a really important clarification and a really important signaling device as well.
Yeah, you mentioned around the law enforcement response there around AI-generated CSAM. There's a interesting or kind of concerning grey area in the middle of, we have AI-generated CSAM, we have CSAM, and then we have AI-generated CSAM, but of real users or real victims. So, yeah, is there a physical harm being committed? Potentially not. Some of the grey area in the middle may have never had any physical harm, but actually are still a victim. They're still a child who is having intimate imagery or sexual abuse material posted about them, is likely being, being used for extortion or exploitation. So yeah, a whole other area that comes in that actually, we're all talking about it as a trust and safety community, but we were talking earlier about is the understanding of this in the kind of public domain really there? We know there's been a huge amount of usage and uptake of many of the kind of AI tools that are available, but actually I think still in the mainstream this is still a new thing, a new problem. We know generally talking about child sexual abuse and talking about these problems is generally not done. It's not something that everybody wants to talk about. It's not something everybody wants to read about. There are things that are happening. We mentioned a few of the examples of things that are happening that are putting this into the mainstream. We're seeing, if anyone's seen the kind of the discussions around Kate Middleton in the UK or kind of globally having the conversations, videos that have been released that are now having a whole bunch of conversations around, are they AI generated? Is this misinformation? I think that problem space is going to continue. I think that actually content that is real is also going to fall into the problem of, well, is this now AI generated? It causes a whole world of confusion. So hopefully we sit here in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and actually there's much more talk about the solutions here. We're probably sitting here just talking about the problem and kind of saying, well, something needs to be done and we need to find a solution for it. Conscious that we've probably got 5 minutes left. If there's anyone in the room, we haven't got a moderator, so, but has anyone got any questions that they would want to ask, any challenges they want to raise in any of the discussion? No, fine. Could have got AI to do it. Anything you kind of want to say in terms of kind of summing up in terms of the work that your teams are doing, the concerns your teams have around this space, and yeah, maybe what do we think it will be when we sit here next year and talk about the same thing?
In response to that question, the one thought that comes to mind is that there's a certain kind of narrative developing around AI-generated CSAM, which posits that AI-generated CSAM is the less harmful alternative to child sexual abuse material or real child sexual abuse material, right? And this argument or this narrative sort of centers on the fact that many AI-generated CSAM sort of materials don't feature real children, but as we've just clarified, that's not always the case, right? There's also an argument being made that AI-generated CSAM may have some therapeutic value, right? So although there isn't a lot of sort of research on this at the moment, but we know that certain people are sort of experimenting with the fact that if you could introduce AI-generated CSAM to known offenders in controlled settings, would this sort of satisfy their urge to sexually abuse a child, right? And the argument goes that if you're able to do this, then maybe they will not go on to abuse a real child, right? But like I said, you know, there's an emerging sort of body of research, but there's no consensus on whether or not this strategy could work or not. The other sort of concern that we have with this narrative is the fact that whether it's real or synthetic, repeated sort of exposure to CSAM material is going to make the sexualization of children more tolerant, right? And we need to sort of stay clear of that. We also need to make sure that we're being attentive to the fact that repeated exposure, again, whether it's real or synthetic CSAM material, can actually whet the appetite of a perpetrator or an offender, so much so that they go on to then engage in more active forms of abuse, right? So they make contact with children, for instance, or they set up a grooming situation, or they set up a meeting in the physical world with the child. I mean, these are very real considerations. So before this narrative sort of develops further, and thinking about the conversation we might have next year, I hope that we've put to bed this sort of particular strand of the conversation that seems to be developing around AI-generated CSAM.
I think maybe just 3 points to finish from me. The first, I think, is around content provenance and authenticity, which I think builds on your point, Shaylee. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of creating standards around watermarking or radioactive data, and so keen to see more sort of industry collaboration around that. I think there are a couple of US-based organizations that are leading on that, mainly sort of in the media space and news publishers. I think the second thing is I'm anticipating over the next 12, 18 months there's going to be a lot more work in sort of technical sandboxes and experimentation, particularly around how hash matching and sort of AI machine learning classifiers can be refined and developed for deepfake detection. As I was saying at the start, that's not one single solution. There's a huge ecosystem of sort of innovators that are needed to help fix this problem because it's multimodal. It's image, it's video, it's text, it's metadata. There's a whole range of different. It's malicious code development, and so please, if you're an innovator that's looking to sort of refine, augment, or build a new sort of solution in and around deepfake detection, come chat afterwards. And then I think finally, just a reflection that there is also a challenge for innovators here around access to training data, particularly if you're an AI machine learning company. And obviously access to AI-generated CSAM is also illegal. So I think there is a problem space there that we've been involved with at Public for the last kind of 2-3 years, looking at sort of how privacy-enhancing technologies can be used to sort of securely and privacy-preserving ways of training on that kind of data. But I am optimistic about sort of where some of the innovation ecosystem is going in this space, but it needs a joined-up system-level approach.
So just in kind of summarizing or kind of wrapping up, I think that one of the things that is worth saying is that, you know, thank you to everybody that is, A, working in trust and safety generally, and B, working on research and development and looking at technology to deal with this problem. Probably a word to any companies that you know have trust and safety teams. I think, and I've said this for a few years, well, I think one of the things that is really important is we need to make sure that the foundations and the environment are there so that people like all of us want to keep doing this work in trust and safety. You know, without trust and safety, well, you know, what would we have? It really isn't the easiest thing for anybody to do. It is a very complex problem. You know, the size of the trust and safety environment compared to the adversarial environment is very, very different. So hopefully we are here, hopefully A, we're all here, and B, more people are here, and we can talk about some of the solutions that are in place, some of the mitigations. Some of them will be societal, some of them will be technological. But yeah, this is it is a challenge. It's a complex challenge. It's something that's moving very, very quickly. And hopefully we'll have some more, you know, positive updates and of course some new challenges the next time we meet. So yeah, please feel free to come and ask us any of the questions you didn't ask, and yeah, thank you very much.